So with that said, we're going to start this first session on email management. Our presenter is Kristopher Stenson. He is the state records manager for the Oregon State Archives, where he helps state and local government manage their information for greater government transparency and efficiency. He is a frequent presenter at government agencies and their association meetings, focusing primarily on topics surrounding technology and electronic records. Chris is a strong advocate for a proactive approach to records management and archives and is passionate about helping others get past their own technological and administrative hurdles. His current major initiative is rolling out our records retention policies in M365 through the Oregon State government. Kristopher currently serves on the board of directors for the National Association of Government Archives and Records Administrators, NAGARA, and has been an active member of the Council of State Archivists State Electronic Records Initiative since its inception. He previously worked as an electronic records archivist at the Illinois State Archives, and Chris is a certified records management and holds a master's degree in library science from Indiana University and an MA in history from Washington State University. So without further ado, I'm turning it over to you, Chris.
All right, thank you very much, Sarah. And I am sorry you had to read all of that. If I had thought about it in advance, I would have given you the truncated version. That's the maximum impact for impressing people version. And usually I try to give a little more reasonable one. So, but thank you. You made it through admirably. Hi, everybody. I'm Chris. It says Kristopher on my official stuff, and that's only just because it cuts out ambiguity when people respond to my emails. Excuse me, got a little thing in my throat. I am the state records manager here at the Oregon State Archives. What does that mean in general? Well, our group oversees records retention schedules, both general and special, for all public entities in Oregon, which is about 5,000 odd different units of government. We don't talk to some of them a whole lot. We also coordinate training and advise other agencies on records management topics. Increasingly these days, this goes into the realm of kind of crosses over into data management, information science stuff. We work frequently with IT departments and data officers talking about how it is we organize and understand our data, our information. So, and as mentioned, my current big project is a statewide rollout of M365 retention policies. Today, I will be specifically talking about how we're approaching applying role-based retention to communications, with a caveat here that here at Oregon State Government, we are a Microsoft shop for the most part. So the examples I may throw at you and the specifics are going to relate to Microsoft 365, Outlook, Exchange, and related products. However, I do want, for those of you who may say immediately, well, I'm a Google shop or something else that doesn't apply, take it with a grain of salt. While the specific mechanisms may differ, the basic planning and functionality should be very similar. And the ways in which we make decisions regarding retention are broadly applicable regardless of what kind of system you are using. So just if you approach with an open mind, I think you'll find relevant content here for you, at least I hope so. As we go along, I welcome questions. I will provide enough time at the end. So if it's something I'm not clear on, pop right in there. Otherwise, maybe we'll wait till the end. I will give plenty of time. I've kept these slides relatively short so that we will have plenty of time to discuss at the end. Let's see if this is going to work now. It does. Yay. Okay. So a little background that should sound pretty familiar to anybody who has worked in government ever, which is sort of the world we lived in before we started talking about systematic controls. Here in the state of Oregon, we have traditionally had a mixture of different technologies, only really half integrated. So some systems completely independent of another, not every agency utilizing the same infrastructure backbone, which isn't totally gone now, but it's less so. A mixture of different types of technologies and acumen with them, private vendors, a central state IT structure, as well as some independent agencies that do their own thing. My agency is one of those that's kind of independent as an agency, and has a semi-connected IT infrastructure, but still independent. It's a little funky. What was common is that a lack of widespread or really any retention or governance regarding information and records within systems, whatever those systems may have been. And when I say systems, I'm referring to everything from HR and payroll systems to procurement systems and accounting systems, any specialty software that agencies use for their own business, for example, as well as the basic office sort of applications that we talk about a lot. So no real governance centrally. Some agencies attempted some did almost nothing at all. An email vault. Now this is familiar to many. An email vault that had been put into place about a decade and a half ago as a remedy to the problem of retaining things on active servers, which at the time usually meant incurring costs from the providers. The idea is at a certain point, emails will be moved to this dark vault that we could then retrieve information from. And well, technically that is correct. But like so many such systems, they were not built totally future-proofed. And over time, those vaults got bigger and bigger, so it started wheezing at the seams. Retrieval times increased, harder to find what you're looking for. And no real end game in sight because no policies have been applied from the start. So content was not differentiated from each other. Other than in terms of, we knew who it was and where it came from, but no system controls to auto purge anything, for example. And a real lack of coordination between statewide IT and records management partners. So traditionally, we've each been in our own lane, and this has been a common problem over the past couple decades as records management has increasingly needed to be involved in the IT sphere. It was either foisted upon IT as their problem, which it isn't, or it was left with records managers who had no connection to the technology that was holding all of this content and thus didn't really have any control over it. So lack of coordination meant that we at the State Archives, for example, could put out records management policies. We could set administrative rules and put out retention schedules, but that was pretty significantly separated from the folks that were running the systems and applying internal system controls. And so while intellectually an agency might know, I need to get rid of this content at 5 years, that message was not always, or in fact, mostly not getting to the IT people who actually would need to pull the trigger, right? That would hold the tools to do that process. And I think this sort of fragmented thing is pretty common, but this is where we found ourselves. And you say, finding ourselves when? Well, let's go back to long, long ago to a time before the world we live in now, which was, according to the calendar, 2019, and that which represents either 4 years ago or last week, depending on our frame of mind on any given moment. It feels like a very long time ago, and at the same time, a blink. So where we found ourselves in March 2019 was that the state was slowly moving towards Microsoft 365. This was it was an upcoming thing. They just rebranded from Office 365, becoming a more all-inclusive solution. And we were just starting to roll that out. My agency, the Secretary of State's office here in Oregon, was an early adopter. So we were on the calendar to get it, but it was still in the infancy. Well, then suddenly, I believe it was March 16th or 17th, 2019, we all went home. The entire state went home. And suddenly, all of us got accelerated. Hey, guess what, guys? You're all at home, and this is how we're going to collaborate. This is how we're going to work. This is how we're going to communicate. In fact, keeping in mind, many of the state employees that were sent home, they did not have state-issued phones, right? So they leave all the office infrastructure behind. How are we going to work? So it was just beginning. Huge acceleration, as I noted, due to that work from home policy. And for some agencies, the work from home was relatively short. However, by and large, most state agencies stayed either fully or partially work from home for the better part of a couple years. And most agencies are not going fully back, have not returned back to a full and won't. My own agency reduced their physical footprint by about half. And so there's really no way the agency will go back to this. So pretty common in many places, I think. But this sudden acceleration, so we're in M365, suddenly we have to figure out how we're going to use this. We have to figure out what we're going to do with it. How are we telling people to use? What tools within it are usable right now and which ones aren't? A lot of things getting pushed out that we could get to, but we're not officially supported yet. In other words, IT would say, hey, you can use it if you want, but we don't have the time right now to train people on it. We don't understand it yet, so use at your own risk sort of stuff, right? This change, while no doubt extremely disruptive and concerning, not to mention the greater geopolitical and health-related concerns across the globe, This represented, however, an opportunity for our field and for our office to engage at the ground level of a massive statewide implementation. Traditionally, the problem has been is that by the time records management has been consulted, the project's already in the ground. It's started, it's been moving along, we're brought in late, it's too late to configure things the way we want, or we aren't consulted at all. Well, this was an opportunity for us to get in there right away. So with this, I reached out to a couple people I knew, the Chief Data Officer, Catherine Darnell-Helms, and she put me in touch with the M365 project team, which thankfully also happened to have a couple people with whom I'd worked in the past and knew of. And they were kind enough to allow me to piggyback on that and start spewing my rhetoric that was going to get in their way, but was necessary anyways. The challenge, as always, that was facing us was limited resources, but a legislative mandate. The state legislature had a couple of years prior said that the central IT would roll out a statewide system like this, and then had promptly seen fit to cut their funding and reduce the number of staff they had to do it, as is typical when people that don't have to do the work are the ones that make the rules about how much you're allowed to spend to do the work. So as I joined this group, we had some competing desires. Obviously, this was an IT-led project, and I had to be respectful of that. I understood what that meant. But there were balancing desires between what a pure records management approach would look like and a pure IT approach. So for one, IT was seeking a simple one-size-fits-all solution that could be deployed to every single agency with no customization or as close therein as we could get. They wanted one size fits all. They wanted central control. They did not want the agencies to control all their own content and make their own rules, because that would essentially lead right back to the problem we'd had before, which is everything's, catch as catch can. On a record management side, we desire precision. We would like for people to be able to granularly identify things and label them. We want customization, acknowledging that the work that every agency does is not identical, and there are unique needs represented at those agencies and would have to be accommodated. And of course, in order to do this efficiently, the agency has to have some control over their content. They have to be able to apply these things themselves to an extent. Otherwise, it will not be nimble enough, and you'll be again in a situation where the people that don't have the knowledge to make the decisions are the only ones that can do the work, and the ones that have the knowledge to make the decisions don't have any access to the systems. So we approached a practical compromise. We knew there'd have to be middle ground, and there was, and it wasn't actually that hard to get to. It was just a matter of getting past our initial points. So IT has agreed to allow agencies some control. Now, I totally understand the need to control it so people can't go completely rogue, but the idea is that at a certain level, decision-making needs to be made at the agency level. Records management, our team, agrees to limit possible variables. We're not going to be throwing a 300-item retention schedule at this system and saying, okay, folks, sort this out. That would essentially be doing nothing at all. That's a lazy approach, and it was never going to work. So using principles of role-based retention, which I will get into in a moment here, using principles of role-based retention, we were going to establish baselines and group exceptions. So the idea is to set a baseline retention and then to identify groups that would have an exception retention that would exceed the baseline. It was agreed that a 3-year default retention would be applied to all communications. So that 3-year default was actually the starting point by which IT went from. And in general, I was okay with that. The difference was the initial conversations were everything's going to be 3 years and agencies will have to move everything else. And I worked with them over time and helped them to understand that that was not going to be successful. And they, in the end, they totally saw that. They just hadn't approached it from that direction before. A 3-year default, meaning that if no action is taken by the agency, it would be 3 years, which I'm comfortable with. It does put the responsibility on the agency, on the records owners, which is as it should be, but it also comes with options. So that 3-year, and when I say all communications, that would initially mean all emails sent and received through state email systems through Exchange, as well as Teams messages sent peer-to-peer or peer-to groups, as well as ones in like meeting chats. We are not at this juncture. These do not necessarily apply directly to official posts on a team. And those of you who don't know Teams, forgive me for getting a smidge wonky, but there are some nuances here. And it's not directly, the same policy is not being directly applied to file stores within SharePoint or other environments like that, although we do have a plan for that as well. Then the last bit of this is a limited set of alternate retentions, right? So if 3 years is the default, what are our other options? Well, we did a little, and I'm trying to remember now if my next slide has this information. So I'm going to sneak ahead real quick here, and it does not. So I'm going to tell you. It is those retentions. We boiled it down by doing an analysis. My team looked at all of our general retention schedules for all the different types of government, and we literally counted up the frequency of certain types of retentions. And then we charted them out, made a nifty little chart, which now to come to think of it, would have been handy to throw onto this slide. But basically, we identified the peaks and valleys of the most common retentions, which gave us a starting point. So from that, we distilled this down to the default 3, 5 years, 7 years, 10 years, 20 years, and permanent. So that's 6 total retentions, only 5 of which need any action to apply. Now, there is a possibility we could add another one. We've had discussions with certain agencies. There may be special cases, but we are going to keep these low. The point here is that's less for us to maintain, less for central IT to have to worry about, and less for the agencies to have to split hairs on. So how is that going to work practically? Well, that's what the next slide gets into a little bit. So role-based retention, as I noted, is a methodology that derives its core from Capstone, which is at this point, old hat, right? 2013, Capstone was announced by the federal government. Capstone, for those of you who may not be completely familiar, basically says for the federal agencies that agencies would identify certain individuals that were more important retention-wise than others. And it's just a simple level. Those would be your Capstone officials. Those Capstone officials, their records will be kept permanently, transferred to the National Archives at the end of whenever their term is, or whenever their time is, or whatever the case would be. And everybody else within an agency would be something else. 5 years, 7 years, the agency would make that decision. So essentially, it's a 2 classification scheme that is efficient. It is easy to apply. For our purposes, we felt it was a little too blunt. So we approached something, and we've been working on this for a number of years, actually. We had just had an initial email workshop like the week before we all went home in 2019. And so then this gave us tools to do it. So role-based retention, as we're referring to it, simply looks at the work products produced by a particular unit, division, program. Hey, the level you apply this at is very much up to you. You can go down to the individual, but that's once again kind of doing the same work every single one. So they look at the work products and they compare those to the retention schedule that governs those work products. We identify the longest likely retention within those, and that becomes their base retention. So once again, if I am looking at my schedule and saying, here are the things I do, and I look on the schedule where those fit, and I say a 10-year, a 5-year, a 3-year, okay, nothing there longer than 10 years, my area will have a 10-year retention by default. Simple? Yes. Time consuming when applied to a 5,000 person agency? Yes. However, straightforward, and it's applicable, right? And scalable, and the same person doesn't have to do all the work, which is the other benefit. So a couple examples here to help maybe visualize this further. So an agency accounting unit. Now, some agencies outsource all their accounting to a central hub. Others do not. My own agency has its own accounting unit. If we look at our retention schedules, the schedules associated with accounting records have a retention between 4 and 6 years when we're looking at this. And by this, a retention group that we were going at, we would pick the longer of the two and say it's 6 years. Now, you might remember, I did not say a 6-year category. Why don't I have a 6-year category in M365? Well, it's because we had a lot of 5s and a lot of 7s and some 6s. And so the reality is we're rounding up the 6s to 7. So in this case, our retention group is 6 years. We're going to be rounding it up to 7 years in M365. You don't have to do that. But essentially, the key here is we are accommodating the longest possible retention. I'm actually gesturing with my mouse right here, and I don't know that you can see it. So pretend I am circling those 2 6s if you can't see it. Now, another group, agency training specialists, okay? So agencies have, sometimes they're situated in HR, sometimes depending on what the agency does, they'd be somewhere else. So on the schedule, they have retentions between 2 and 5 years. Well, in that case, their retention group is going to be a 5-year retention group. Senior leadership roles, senior management, division directors, agency heads, their roles are going to differ from the units they oversee in some cases, and therefore their retention responsibilities may be more. So what we've envisioned in many cases, and we've seen in some of our initial rollouts, is that while a unit or a program might have a 5-year retention, it's entirely possible their director and say deputy director, they might actually be in a 10-year retention group because they deal with higher agency level policy decisions. They have more budgeting stuff. There's other factors that play in administrative type records, not just the program records, right? So that's something to be aware of and think about the nuance there. But typically, most places, you might have a senior leadership group, and then by the time you get down to line managers or unit managers, usually they can be lumped in with the same. Now, a bit of a caveat here, conditional retentions. A retention that says retain 3 years after end of contract, or retention that says 6 years after equipment disposed of, or whatever the case may be, right? Well, that is impossible to do by this method, because otherwise you have a continuously rolling retention on your email. There's no way to schedule emails in a box if the condition that you have to meet to start the trigger hasn't happened yet, right? There's no smart enough system to do that in what we're doing. So in those scenarios, agencies will still need to identify those within the units, and those will be a work process where, hey, they already shouldn't live in email. I mean, this is already a thing they probably should already be doing. They should not be in email, and if they are, move them out. They have a designated home. The good news is most of these types of records, contract records, HR files, variable things like this, they already have their own files, and they already have a place to file things with. So it's a matter of identifying those. The actual filing burden is very, very low on most people. And so even on people that have a few of these, it's still going to be lower than technically what they have right now. So we don't see this as a major hurdle. It's just an acknowledgement of a limitation of this methodology. To work around this would require a heck of a lot more computer work in terms of programming special rules and conditions. And you might have the stomach to do that within a single agency or department that you have the desire to do that. But keep in mind, we're doing this for, I don't know exactly. I think we have 70,000 state employees. So I'm not doing that for 70,000 people. I don't know about you. So it's just a matter of how much you really want to get in the weeds to do that. It's simpler to ask people to do a thing. So how do we actually do this? So in this, this is talking about how we're rolling this out and how we're presenting to people. So put on your hat here where, hey, maybe this is something I'd like to try within my own context. How am I going to have this happen? Who do I need to be involved? Well, here's a few key people we've identified. Key roles. Records manager, maybe that's you, maybe that's this person within the agency, whatever. They're going to lead this, right? This is owned by records management. It is a records management methodology using records management tools. You're going to need an administrative champion. I don't think this is a surprise to anybody. This is the same with any project you want off the ground. You have to get somebody high enough up the food chain to make people do it, to help us get through those roadblocks, to sponsor it. Because without that agency buy-in, you will find a lot of resistance, or simply people slow rolling it, right? They'll say, oh yeah, sure, and it won't get prioritized. So you do have to have buy-in from the top level. And you're going to need subject matter experts from the programs. Unless you or the records manager knows every single job within the agency top to bottom, which if there's 6 of you, maybe you do. But most cases, you're not going to know that. You're going to need those subject matter experts. They might be longtime employees, senior deputy types, right? Maybe it's a person that's been a lead there for 20 years and knows the inside and out of every bit of the work. There's no necessary, it doesn't have to be the top person in the group. It might not be in many cases, right? So, but the idea is subject matter experts, whoever they may be, they're going to be the ones that feed that information to help those decisions. Within each program, you're going to list the major functions, right? And this is a brainstorming activity. It's like, hey, go to your team, say, what do you do, right? And list them out in very broad senses. What do you do? Okay. Now you're going to compare that to your schedule, and you're going to flag literally 2 lists, and you're going to go, that's there, that's there, that's there. And you're just going to make a list of all the things there. You don't need to worry about tying them all together and figuring out, no. Just check them off. Okay. Now you're going to filter out those where email isn't the home. So now that's another job for the group. Hey, of these ones we flagged over here, how many of these actually are in email as the primary home, or is it all ancillary, or did they not touch email at all, right? Scratch those off. They are not part of those are not part of our consideration. So now we have a much smaller list. What we're left with is things that relate to our functions, and we know have at least some component within the email system where it may still be, right? We're also going to flag any conditional retentions that I just mentioned, right? Any of those retentions that are retained 5 years after something, right? Those we're going to not cross off, but we're going to asterisk those. We're going to have to make special rule for that in terms of with the unit. Like, hey folks, we've made you all a 5-year, but these are all an 8-year retention. You're going to need to pull those out. And then we're going to identify, once we've done all that filtering, identify the longest retention from the remaining ones in our list. And there shouldn't be that many left. And you identify the longest one and say, okay, that's your default retention. And if people in the unit say, that's way too long, you say, okay, the option is we flag that one as another outside the rule one, and you all have to commit to moving it out of email. Maybe they're pretty rare and that's okay, right? So sometimes you do have those outliers, like, oh, 90% of our records are 7 years. And then we have this one series that's 25. Do you want to keep all your emails for 25 years because of that? If there's not that many of them, probably not. You just need to have better procedures and workflow, right? However, if that's actually a huge amount of the work you do, even though it's one series, maybe you just say, yeah, we're going to roll with it. We're a 25-year retention because of that. So here's an example of a tracking sheet. It's off of an Excel spreadsheet here that we've identified to help people sort of identify this, right? So I know it's a little small, but the idea here, so on the left, a division, right? So business services is our division. Inside the division is a program, finance. Inside the program is a unit, accounting and procurement in this case. Now, do you have to drill down this low? Absolutely not. This is showing it fairly granular. You can always stay up a higher level. Now, the level here, this is a management / non-management toggle that we identified. You don't have to do this, but you know how I mentioned how management may in fact get flagged for different. So that's what that's there for. The longest cited retention. So when we do all of our little checkoffs, in the end, we're left with one series. Now, this is how our citations on our general schedules look. This is what we write down here. Why? Because that's the authority under which we are going to be destroying all of these records. So it's important for us to cite the specific series that we're pointing to. This is not averaging it out or picking a number out of the air. No, we are pointing to an actual legally binding series that we are going to use to trigger this. And that gives us a little more, it gives it a little more of official nature to it, right? In this example here, I do have some in here for the procurement group, right? It only says longest cited retention, 1 year, and that's for scheduling records. Why? Well, because all of the procurement specific records live within our statewide procurement system. And so we don't have to worry about email for those. And as such, the procurement unit actually has a very short need for email retention because almost all their work is elsewhere. Accounting, on the other hand, does not have a specialized system yet. And so their email has a lot more stuff. And so theirs is the 6-year retention. Now, the next column, and this is the part where your particular application will absolutely vary. But in our case, because of those M365 groups, they don't totally align. So, hey, it's a 6-year retention cited. It's going to be in the 7-year group. In this case, we don't have anything shorter than 3 years, and I don't necessarily think we should. And so that's a 3-year retention for the procurement group, even though the longest one we'd cite would be 1 year, right? So that's what we're pointing to. We also have a note here. Note for, so in this case, Oregon Buys, that's the name of our procurement system. Oregon Buys is the system of record for procurement records. I've noted that. Why have I done that? So that the next time this exercise is done, and I may not be the one doing it, people understand why I made that decision. They go, wait a second, procurement has all sorts of 6-year records. Why on earth? And that explains it, right? We want to make this easier for people going forward. This is just a sample. Your results may vary, but this is the one we've started with. And you know, if you were to check back maybe in a year when we've worked with more agencies, we'll probably have different examples. This is just kind of us working through the early phases of this. So how are things going? Well, the evidence thus far shows it's going pretty well. We began meeting with agencies. So we did throughout March, we did a series of March and April, I think. We did a series of road shows where we gave general information sessions. Now that I'm thinking about it, it might have started in February. We've been planning for this for a very long time. We started meeting with, we did some general road shows to give information. We spread this out to major agency leadership groups, CIOs, and records officers. So they weren't surprised. We began meeting one-on-one with agencies to do analysis in April. So initially, we've been meeting with a lot of our boards and commissions, which tend to be very small and have a limited number of staff. Kind of a good way to get our feet wet. In many cases, we've had one meeting, and that's all we needed. Literally, we had one meeting, had a conversation, we're easily able to figure out what it was, bada bing, bada boom. So in those small entities, what we're seeing largely is very flat, because a lot of people wear different hats, and it's mostly one retention, right? All 9 members, all 9 employees are going to get the same retention. Easy peasy, right? And so essentially, we're making a note of that, and then we haven't even gotten to the technical implementation yet, but we'll do that next. Bigger agencies, more layers, right? And then will take longer. So we have some really big agencies. We have an agency, our big combined health authority and human services. They're north of 25,000 employees. That's going to take a long time, right? And so we know that, and we've already had conversations with them, and we have a roadmap for them. It's just a much longer roadmap than for these little ones. Management and administration are getting their own retention, we're finding still. So that is our initial thought, and that is what we are seeing. Shared inboxes, right? What do we do about shared email accounts? Well, it's a mixed bag thus far. In some cases, procedurally, they're just a dumping ground for incoming stuff and all the work happens elsewhere. In other words, comes in here, it gets picked up by one of our employees and they do the work in their own box. In that case, that gets the default. There's no reason for a longer retention on that inbox. It's just a receiving point. In others, the shared boxes are used to conduct the work back and forth. And in that case, they're getting the same retention as the rest of the employees. So mixed bag, but it's a case by case sort of situation. So what are some fringe benefits that we are either seeing or projecting out for this? Well, the actual process of doing the analysis serves as a tool to help clean up messy practices. There's nothing like shining the light on a really ugly workflow when you're doing this to go, oh, why are we doing all that? Yeah, that's a good point. So this is an opportunity to fix things that have been broken for a while. It's an opportunity to find the things that you thought were hidden, right? Or to identify things that you didn't know existed, right? There's a good opportunity here. Clearly identifying correct workflows is a benefit of this, right? So we have that conversation. So talk to me when we're looking at the schedule. You got a 25-year on that. What happens to those records, right? Oh, they're in the email. And then what? Well, we have a filing system that everybody puts them in there. And then at the end of the case, everything's wrapped up with a bow and put in there. Great. We don't have to worry about that in email. In another case, though, somebody said, well, they're supposed to do that. Well, okay, what's your compliance like? I'm not totally sure. Okay, then that's a conversation we just sparked. They're going to go back to their team and say, what's our practice look like here? We need to tighten this up, because if we don't, all of our email has to be kept 25 years. Most people don't want that. So it provides impetus. And in the meanwhile, we can make that out of retention. So that is absolutely something that we can see a benefit from. Updating schedules and policies. Our biggest push right here, right now, is to update all of the special retention schedules for agencies. There were a number of them, small ones that were quite out of date. And this gives the motivation and the sort of push to update those, because that has to happen. You can't make decisions on retention unless you know that these schedules are accurate. And if they don't depict whole programs, then we got a problem there. There's no way we're going to make correct decisions. So that's the first part of the work. And we're getting a better understanding statewide of the concept of systems of record. So systems of record is something that's actually come simultaneously. What do they call it? Convergent evolution, when you talk about two species that have evolved the same thing without ever interacting with one another in different ecological niches. So the idea is that we are coming up with the same thing in different places, different disciplines. This idea of system of record, it comes from information security and data, information science, right? Data governance, as well as records management. The idea is you need to know where your stuff is and where it's supposed to be in order to control it, whatever your control looks like. So better understanding of systems of record across the board. We're having an opportunity to have these discussions with agencies to help them identify these. And it doesn't have to be scary, right? We're doing a records inventory essentially, but less granular on this is where this file is kept. It's more about broadly, what room is that kept in, so to speak, but in the digital sense, right? What system does it live in? I'm not getting down to the level of file structure necessarily, but we are talking about where in a broad sense these live. So better understanding of systems of records and helping agencies better conceptualize the environment that all of their information lives in. So all of this has been talking about all the thinky stuff we're doing, right? The conversations we're having. So what's the technical side going to look like? Well, that's going to vary a lot case by case, right? Like I said, and I've shown multiple times here, our environment is M365. You might be totally different. You might be in a Google environment or in some hodgepodge of different environments or a non-cloud connected solution. It doesn't matter. You can still do this. It's just the way you apply the retentions will differ, right? The amount of automation you can bring to play may differ. So manual tracking and application is cumbersome, but it works, right? So even in a completely, you can do this in a paper-based world, right? We are applying retention labels within Exchange and applying policies within M365. You can also apply sorry, I misspoke there. If you just have an Exchange environment, not an M365, you can apply retention labels directly within Exchange. Within M365, you apply the policies at a higher level and they get percolated out to all the different applications. Google, I know, has an equivalent. I don't know anything about it. So I'm just going to say some Google equivalent. Again, I don't know that technology the same way, but I know the functionality should be there. It's just that they call it something different. So a little bit of wonkiness before I finish up and have time for conversation here. And I'm sorry I keep itching my nose. It's high pollen season here in the Willamette Valley, and that's no joke. So here in the state of Oregon, what are we doing? Well, as I mentioned, we are utilizing a set of master retentions. Now we are using within M365 Purview, previously known as the eDiscovery Center. The beautiful thing about all this technology is it's all changing so rapidly. Microsoft keeps changing stuff on a monthly basis, so you never know what you're going to get. But I told you about our policies. We are applying these using something called adaptive policy scopes. In this, basically, we're utilizing a metadata tag that gets applied to individuals' Active Directory profiles. And then this scope constantly searches for those metadata tags. And when it sees them, it applies the policy we've specified. So the policy says, retain 7 years, comma, destroy, okay? We apply the number 7 to a particular field in somebody's user profile. This adaptive scope searches for that. And when it finds it, it says, aha, and it attaches the 7-year policy to that person. If we change that number on the metadata, it updates it and changes it to whatever the policy should be. It's using a very complicated tool. This tool is actually used to key on keywords or characteristics to set retentions in a smarter way. We're using it in a very simple, kind of dumb way, but it's going to be effective because it'll work in 100% of cases. This is the challenge. We had to find a tool that would work in all of our different environments with all the different ways people are using it. And that wasn't as easy as we thought. We had several false starts and went down some blind alleys before we found the one that's going to work. So a key part of this is that litigation holds within the system overrule all policies. So people concerned about, well, what if we have these legal holds? I'm like, no, it will not auto-destroy anything if there's a legal hold in place. Those hold primacy over these policies that have been applied. And end users can then manage their own Outlook as however they want. So this is also beneficial for users who have different sort of philosophies on how they like to work and whether or not they do the whole inbox zero thing, or whether they're like me and it's just kind of a giant stream and we move stuff out when we can, but we largely are just working out of one box. You can do that. You can delete stuff out of your Outlook and it won't actually do anything. The copy that is retained at the server level is protected by this policy. You cannot override it on an individual user end basis. So it's very safe that way. And they can't touch it. There you go. Can't touch this. I'm sorry. I'm not really sorry. I'm kind of proud of it, but we'll move on. And there's more. So this also applies to Teams chats. I mentioned those back and forth things between individuals. And there's some nuances on how it applies and what copy gets saved. I'm not going to get into all that. If you're curious, I'd be happy to talk to you another time, but I don't want to bore everybody. And we have future plans to apply in SharePoint, Teams channels, and OneDrive. But the mechanism will be different. Those environments are not keyed on a person's profile, but rather what the unit area is. So using the same sort of philosophy, but basically a whole SharePoint site could be made 7 years, and regardless of who puts stuff in there, it would all get 7 years. And that would be based upon what the site is used for. And the same thing with a team. Those tend to be more subject-oriented, right? Or team-oriented, not individual-oriented. OneDrive remains a bit of a hot topic. It would typically be applied the same way our correspondence is because it is your own stash. However, we've gotten some pushback from folks about how they use OneDrive and with concerns about that. So we're kind of negotiating out the nuances there on exactly how we're going to handle OneDrive, but we'll get there. The biggest concern was the communication stuff. It's the most we have. It's the most problematic. It's the most requested. So the rest of this unstructured content will come. We didn't want to roll it out at the same time and confuse the issue. So we're going to be working on this over the next couple of years still. Okay, I promised I'd keep it under time. I did. We got a few minutes for questions. So I've got the chat up. You can throw them in there. You can unmute yourself to do that. And, you know, I'll go until they tell me to shut up.
All right. Thank you, Chris. That was so informative and actually got us thinking, well, me thinking personally, on how we're going to tackle our own email management here at the state of Wyoming. So if anybody has any questions, Cindy Brown is asking, how are legislative holds implemented?
Is that a typo? Did you mean to say like legal holds, like eDiscovery?
Yes, I meant to say legal. Sorry about that, Chris.
No, it's fine. I got your meaning. Yeah, so actually it is within the same area, within the same backend area that, admin users have. What you do is you create this blank box, which is, hey, create legal hold for, state of Oregon versus blank, right? So we create that blank legal hold. Then we do the searches for e-discovery, just like we would for a public records request, right? You're doing a search through the system for the types of things. So stuff within this date range from this account using this keywords or whatever else, like you would in almost any environment where you're constructing a search query. You're going to put that in there, and then you're going to say, apply the legal hold. It will then search through the system and apply a legal hold, which does not allow any destruction or modification to happen to that content until the legal hold is released. And it will hold, and it supersedes any other rules that are put in place. Those holds can be put on a finite period of time. So you could say this legal hold is only subject for the next 3 months or whatever, or you can have it open-ended, and until you release that hold or change the characteristics of that hold, anything that's subject. So nothing gets moved, which is nice. And we've had this experience in other systems. You're not moving records to another place. You're not making copies of them necessarily, because in many cases, these legal holds are anticipatory, right? You don't actually know 100% what you're gonna need to get. And so it allows you to freeze a whole chunk of content, and then you can narrow it down later. Or once you've retrieved the copies that were subject that you knew you needed, you can release the hold for all the rest of the stuff. So I'm not honestly the expert on that. I've just learned a little bit through working with the techs on that, but it's a dual part of it. We've made really clear, that for the agencies, when we roll out these retentions, it's going to be imperative that they remember, that they know to apply legal holds in this system as well, when they're doing these things. So that's actually super important. So say, hey, when we turn on that retention trigger, this stuff's going to go unless you pay attention. So it should be all right, but it's, we'll see the first time somebody screws something up and they get mad at us.
So do we have any other questions for Chris at this time? You can either throw it in the chat box, or you can direct message me, or you can go ahead and unmute yourself and ask Chris yourself. Chris, I'm just curious. So this is an automated system. It, like, once you have your trigger come up, it automatically deletes it.
Yeah.
Do you guys have any logs showing, documenting what has been deleted?
Right. So with the caveat that we have not turned this on yet.
Right.
Actually, we have the framework. We know it's supposed to work. We've worked with Microsoft. We've plotted it out. We've created some initial policies. For our rollout phase, we're going to be doing a lot of technical testing in a QA data set starting in late August. And we're going to take a couple months doing that. So that should tell us exactly. But yes, the system metadata tracks deleted objects, things like that. Now, how detailed that information is, I don't know yet. I don't know that it's going to be crazy detailed, because metadata takes up space, and having operated another system, just the destruction logs over time build up, right? Just the legacy metadata. And so it may be a question of how much of this do we really need, and how important is that? But the other part is you can choose to have it do a retain 7 years, delete, or retain 7 years, notify, or retain 7 years, do nothing. And that one literally just, it notes that it's due for destruction, but it doesn't actually destroy it until somebody goes in there and says, yes, execute that one. So all of which are models that could work depending on people's comfort level. In the case of the email correspondence, I'm going full hog, right? We're telling people we're going straight forward, because if we allow people the option to go, I'm not sure, they will use it and nothing will ever go. I'm sorry. We're over people at this point.
Okay.
However, I can see potentially SharePoint sites or other things like that, and maybe folks choosing to utilize the do this and then notify us so we can review port. It's entirely possible. Let's see, we do have a question.
Yep. Glenn Smith is asking, do you believe it will be able to replace destruction certifications if states require such?
Yeah, that's a good question, Glenn. And it's funny, I've worked in a couple different states, one of which requires explicit sign off on all destructions, and then one here in Oregon that does not. It's going to require a leap in understanding about what is the certificate, what purpose does it hold, right? So it depends on the bureaucracy you're working with, put it nicely, and how have they jumped, for example, to accepting e-signatures or digital signatures. Maybe it's a PIN code instead of an actual physical signature. If they have, well, they've already made that leap, right? Acknowledging that really it's just an authority acknowledgement. Well, The next step from that is acknowledging that the system controls were put in place by authorized individuals, signed off on by the agency head. The system executed those per those requirements. And it does have some level of metadata. Again, asterisk here, check your local, check your forums for the specifics, because I haven't gotten into it yet. And it will retain some metadata about which objects were destroyed based upon which policy. So that all there shows, shows authority. It shows a chain of authority, and it shows the process. Do the people in charge trust that? That your mileage may vary, and it may take a little while. In case you may in fact need to do that, notify, extract list, go to sign off authority. This is not dissimilar to what we do, say, at our state record center, where we extract a spreadsheet of the stuff that's due and we send it to the agency to sign off.
Yeah.
And so all of these things may be possible. And I think if we can talk to people and say, listen, it shows the authority, right? The authority was granted, and then this is the actual acknowledged event. And the other part, of course, is making sure that the agencies understand the tool and understand how to override the tool when necessary. And I think if we make sure that's clear, like, hey, you can put a hold on this if there's a concern, and make sure that mechanism is part of it, I think that should go a long ways.
Right. I think you answered the question perfectly. Do we have a couple more minutes? Do we have any other questions at this time? Okay, well, I'm not seeing any, but as you can see, Chris's contact information is here on the screen, and feel free to email him, reach out to him, and then we will, Chris might be joining us for the last session of the day. If not, then we can go ahead and provide Chris's email address later on today.